Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Thursday, or we're pretending it is Thursday, August 27th, 2020. I told you on Thursday we would be hitting the road and unable to produce the live show, so we are pre-recording something for you. It's a bad week to leave you in the lurch, of course, but we won't be able to review in real time what happened at the Republican National Convention on Wednesday, but I assume Donald Trump took some time and said some horrible things and lied a whole lot, and some other people screamed at the audience, and I think that probably catches us up with everything you needed to know about what may or may not have happened or is going to happen later on at the Republican National Convention. And I'll bet I'm pretty accurate, too. All right, so today we are on the road, as I mentioned. It's time to get the eldest back to college, which seems like an extraordinarily dangerous and difficult thing to do, given what has happened elsewhere, but not a whole lot of choice, although the school has been pretty flexible and I guess is allowing people to stay home and take their classes from home, and even offering them the option to come back to campus and take their classes from their dorm rooms, which I think seems like an extraordinarily boring thing to do. But kids are anxious to get back to campus in some cases. I wouldn't say that he's exactly anxious to get back. I think the whole pandemic has got him appropriately nervous, which is actually, I think, a good sign for at least his own personal behavior and accountability for trying to help contain and suppress the spread of the virus. And the kids he's rooming with, too, pretty much on the same wavelength. It's the rest of the campus that we're worried about. And it's an awfully difficult thing to do, especially, if you're joining up with a new group of roommates and you were to, we thought about this, like backing off and saying, well, maybe we'll come down there if the school remains open for more than 2 weeks or whatever. We'll come down and join you. But who wants to be 2 weeks late to the first day of school? It doesn't really help things mesh. So there's a lot of social aspects to it that we had to take into account. And like I said, he'll remain pretty safe. And I assume, based on nothing, that the first outbreaks, if they finally do experience them, will happen elsewhere. But you never know. And fingers crossed, and we have our plan together for isolating him for the requisite 14 days or so upon his return, should campus shut down. It's not going to be easy, but I may have mentioned this before in the past. If anyone's built for quarantine and lockdown, my kids are ready to do it and ready to go, and the eldest in particular. Staying on his computer and in his room for 14 days with us delivering occasional foodstuffs is right up his alley. I think he would actually have preferred that we spent the summer that way, but we made him emerge from the room to come downstairs and get something to eat. So, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. But we're on our way, and as you hear this, we'll be driving down, and whatever. We should be back tonight and in place for a Friday show just to wrap things up and get back on track for the weekend ahead. All right, so I mentioned there were a couple of things that you might have heard me skip over in my flipping through the virtual pages of Pocket and saying, I know that sounds like maybe a more of an evergreen story that I can share with you guys on Thursday. Well, it's Thursday now. What was the big scoop that I've been keeping from you? And have you been on the edge of your seat ever since? Probably not. But in case that was the case, well, now you can relax. Here's what I say for you here. I thought this was interesting. Just the number of times we've called her name on the show, it makes it of interest to our longtime listeners. From the New York Times, a profile by Ben Smith, not everyone's favorite New York Times employee, but Good choice for a profile here. How Zeynep Tufekci keeps getting the big things right. And I probably should have, for this big profile, checked in on the actual pronunciation of her name. But I think we kind of have it there. That's pretty close. And I think that's in keeping with all of the Turkish pronunciation of names I've heard so far. Not steeped in Turkish culture, but I'm getting the idea. But check this out. How Dr. Tufekci, a computer programmer who became a sociologist, sounded an early alarm on the need for protective masks. It wasn't the first time she was right about something big. And it does seem like on the one hand, I was going to say, it does seem like she has sensible approaches and solutions to a number of very varied problems. Another way of looking at it is wherever there's a problem, Zeynep Tufekci is lurking somewhere nearby. And that presents more difficulty, that formulation. Anyway, here we have the profile. It was published on August 23rd. So what is that, this Sunday piece? Here we go. When the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention told Americans in January that they didn't need to wear masks, Dr. S. Vincent Rajkumar, a professor at the Mayo Clinic and the editor of the Blood Cancer Journal — they got all the best journal names this week — couldn't believe his ears. But he kept silent until Zeynep Tufekci — oh, look, a pronunciation guide — pronounced Zeynep. Yeah, we got that. Tufekci. Yeah, all right. Excellent. Awesome. I feel really good about that. Thank you, Turkish soap operas on Netflix, for that one. Okay, so he stayed silent until Zeynep Tufekci, a sociologist he had met on Twitter, wrote that the CDC had blundered by saying protective face coverings should be worn by health workers but not ordinary people. Here I am, the editor of a journal in a high-profile institution, yet I didn't have the guts to speak out that it just doesn't make sense. Dr. Rajkumar told me everybody should be wearing masks. Dr. Tufekci, an associate professor at the University of North Carolina's School of Information and Library Science, with no obvious qualifications in epidemiology, came out against the CDC recommendation in a March 1st tweet storm, linked herein, before expanding on her criticism on a March 17th op-ed article for the New York Times. And I think we probably, I don't know if we discussed them both, but I certainly glanced at both when they were first made available. It occurs to me now, if she's at the University of North Carolina, does that put her at Chapel Hill and mean that she's been on hand watching the collapse of their opening? I guess so. The CDC changed its tune in April, advising all Americans above the age of 2 to wear masks to slow the spread of coronavirus. Michael Basso, a senior health scientist at the agency who had been pushing internally to recommend masks, told me Dr. Tufekci's public criticism of the agency was the tipping point. In recent years, many public voices have gotten the big things wrong: election forecasts, the effects of digital media on American politics, the risk of pandemic. Dr. Tufekci, a 40-something who speaks a mile a minute with a light Turkish accent, has none of the trappings of the celebrity academic or the professional pundit, but long before she became perhaps the only good amateur epidemiologist, she had quietly made a habit of being right on the big things. And the success of Dr. Tufekci and others like her at seeing clearly in our murky time represents a kind of revenge of the nerds, as outsiders from American politics and from Silicon Valley's pressure to align money and ideology sometimes see what insiders don't. In 2011, she went against the current to say the case for Twitter as a driver of broad social movements had been oversimplified. In 2012, she warned news media outlets that their coverage of school shootings could inspire more. In 2013, she argued that Facebook could fuel ethnic cleansing. In 2017, she warned that YouTube's recommendation algorithm could be used as a tool of radicalization. I think we probably picked up her stream of thought right around there, now that I think about it. And when it came to the pandemic, she sounded the alarm early while also fighting to keep parks and beaches open. I've just been struck by how right she's been, said Julia Marcus, an infectious disease epidemiologist at Harvard Medical School. I was curious to know how Dr. Tufetsky had gotten so many things right in a confusing time, so we spoke last week over FaceTime. Good thing it wasn't Zoom. Anyway, she told me that she chalks up her habits of mind in part to a childhood she wouldn't wish on anyone. A bunch of things came together, which I'm happy I survived, she said, sitting outside a brick house she rents for $2,300 a month in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Why did you need to know that? Not really sure about why you need to know her rent, but now we know she's in Chapel Hill anyway, and not some other campus, where she is raising her 11-year-old son as a single parent, which is weird because I don't think an 11-year-old should be allowed to be a parent at all, but that's the way she's chosen to raise him. I think they meant the other thing, but whatever. The way they came together, that is the things in her childhood, was not super happy when it was happening. These are, by her lights, the ingredients in seeing clearly. Not actually, I guess, a description of what happened in her childhood, but that's fine. We don't really need to know that. Okay, an international point of view that she picked up while bouncing, as a child between Turkey and Belgium, and then working in the United States. Now, that is unfortunate, ending up in Belgium at any point. I don't know, doesn't sound that terrible, but bouncing around can be rough on kids, and we don't know what kind of bouncing that really was. Knowledge, next, that spans subject areas and academic disciplines, a good thing, which she happened onto as a computer programmer who got into sociology. And that is a terrible thing, getting into sociology. But, we'll put that down for later. Third, a habit of complex systems-based thinking, which led her to a tough critique in The Atlantic of America's news media in the run-up to the pandemic. Add those things to a skill at moving journalism and policy through a kind of inside game, and Dr. Tufetsky has had a remarkable impact. But it began, she says, with growing up in an unhappy home in Istanbul. She said her alcoholic mother was liable to toss her into the street in the early hours of the morning. She found some solace in science fiction. Ursula K. Le Guin, I hope I have that name pronounced correctly, was a favorite, and I bet there's a bunch of fans there who know that I either got it horribly wrong or are proud of me for getting it right. Well, she was a favorite and in the optimistic early internet. Okay, that is, I've ruined the sentence there. Her mother would send her out into the street. She found solace in science fiction, mentioning her favorite writer, and also in the optimistic early internet. Got it? Okay, sorry I ruined that. In the mid-1990s, still a teenager, she moved out. Soon she found a job nearby as a programmer for IBM. She was an office misfit, a casually dressed young woman among the suits, but she fell in love with the company's internal bulletin board. She liked it that a colleague in Japan wouldn't know her age or gender when she asked a technical question. She stumbled onto the wellspring of her career when she discovered an email list, the Zapatista Solidarity Network, centered on indigenous activists in southern Mexico who had taken up arms against neoliberalism in general and land privatization imposed by the North American Free Trade Agreement in particular. For Dr. Tufetsky, the network provided a community of digital friends and intellectual sparring partners. In 1998, she traveled to Chiapas, Mexico, and saw that the Zapatistas themselves were engaged in a traditional peasant uprising, the kind of thing that might have happened decades earlier. But now there was something new, the online global community around them. Perhaps because of a kind of egalitarian nerd ideology that has served her well, she never sought to meet the rebels' charismatic leader, known as Subcomandante Marcos. I have a thing that fame and charisma screws with your head, she said. I've made an enormous effort throughout my life to preserve my thinking. Dr. Tufetsky is the only person I've ever spoken with who believes that the modern age began with Zapatista solidarity. Now, that would be a rather rare thing, I think. For her, it was a first flicker of the bottom-up globalization that she sees as the shadow of capitalism's glossy spread. She claims that her theory has nothing to do with how the movement affected her personally. She got a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, studying what she calls techno-sociology, and became obsessed with how digital media could change society during the Twitter-fueled social movements of the late aughts. The Arab Spring, I'm reluctant to call them the late aughts, but the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, Gezi Park, and her native Turkey. I've probably mispronounced that name, but moving on. While many American thinkers, you idiots, were wide-eyed about the revolutionary potential of social media, she developed a more complex view, one she expressed when she found herself sitting to the left of Teddy Goff, the digital director for President Obama's re-election campaign, at a South by Southwest panel in Austin in 2012. Mr. Goff was enthusing about the campaign's ability to send different messages to individual voters based on the digital data it had gathered about them. Dr. Tufekci quickly objected to the practice, saying that micro-targeting would more likely be used to sow division. And again here, the optimistic early internet. If you were enthused by it, you also noticed pretty quickly that there was a dark downside to it too. And then when the rest of the world discovered first the internet and then the dark downside, you were already prepared for it and thinking about it. I've just seen others touching on a very similar subject, perhaps a note to self. All right, maybe I'll think about that one as I scribble that note to myself, and we'll see if we can't get back to it, or teaser for some other week. Anyway, more than 4 years later, you can see what's coming here, after Donald J. Trump won the 2016 election, Mr. Goff sent Dr. Tufekci a note saying she had been right. At a time when everybody was being stupidly optimistic about the potential of the internet, she didn't buy the hype, he told me. She was very prescient in seeing that there would be a deeper rot to the role of data-driven politics in our world. Dr. Tufekci's views on tech were not uncommon among the small group of sociologists focused on new technologies, but she delivered her skeptical take at a time when the social sciences and qualitative research had fallen out of fashion. The rise of digital was all about the numbers, and the tech machers, yes, I think that's what we're talking about here, using a little Yiddish terminology, and their cheerleaders in academe were suspicious of anything that could not be quantified. Big data had elbowed out sociological observation. Many tech journalists, entranced by the internet-fueled movement sweeping the globe, were slow to spot the ways they might fail or how social media could be used against them. Dr. Tufekci, though, had, quote, seen movement after movement falter because of a lack of organizational depth and experience, of tools or culture for collective decision-making and strategic long-term action, she wrote in her 2017 book, Twitter and Tear Gas. That is, the same social media savvy that hastened their rise sometimes left them unable to engage in the tactical and decision-making maneuvers all movements must master to survive, she wrote. Very interesting, and an old problem, the change from activist to policy, the policy side, right? Advocate, I guess, as Greg sometimes puts it. And also the transition from activist to practitioner. It's the same transition that we're talking about. But interestingly, I guess before I lose the thought entirely, what this earlier point put me in mind of when she was saying that when we were commenting on how she saw the dark side of the ability to do micro-targeting and saw it clearly and saw micro-targeting very differently than Goff did. If I remember correctly, it was over this past weekend. I'm pretty sure I can pull this up somewhere too. But I happened to see a conversation going on that Virginia Heffernan had started. You may know her on Twitter as Page 88. I believe we read a couple of her threads over the years on the show. And I didn't realize that this was the case, but I guess she too was an early adopter of the online miracle before there was even the internet. and was asking questions of people, did anybody else, essentially have this experience and find themselves online in the early 80s. And in her case, I think even the late 70s. And I had to chime in because, I absolutely had that same experience for me, early 80s, calling bulletin board systems BBSs back in those days, and other online communication systems pre-internet. And we were talking about that. But basically her point in her questioning in this discussion was, it's really all very connected to a lot of different subjects. She was asking, do you feel like your early experience taught you how to resist some of the panics and scares about the internet and other things that swept through the 80s and which have become recently the topic of discussion with respect to what's going on in QAnon and the panic that it's inspiring among people who become its adherents. She was speaking, I think, specifically of early 80s panics among, say, parents groups about lyrics in music and the links between, they claimed between satanic influences and in particular heavy metal music, etc. And then a possible linkage there between the occult and people taking up the hobby of Dungeons and Dragons, for instance. All kinds of just crazy stuff. And, people who actually had some, dipped a toe in those waters, either one, would tell you, there's no real satanic influence going on here. But, she was just interested in finding out, had I... did I have some experience in the online world that prepared me to be less credulous and more skeptical of today's internet-based and social media-based online world that others are only just catching up to? And I think for the most part agreed with that. I certainly arrived at the internet era very well aware of the danger of purposefully or accidentally sharing personally identifying details that could help locate you or give access to important information and accounts that were also maintained online. You get the idea. But it was interesting to see her writing about it. And then apparently she had written about it in a, was it New York Times piece? Let me see. I think, as a matter of fact, here it is from the New York Times. My Wired Youth. Subheader here in the tweet. Anyway, coming of age online 25 years ago was more and less than a game. But a write-up that she did in about 2009, she was just writing about what it was like to kind of grow up online early in the early 80s and even late 70s, and what sort of inoculation that gave you against some of the future panics, both with regard to what it's like to be online and how you can be taken advantage of or fooled online, and with respect to QAnon as well. As a matter of fact, I think I've finally found that thread, so maybe I'll put that one aside for later. And we'll continue, though, about Zeynep Tufekci and finding out more about her. Where do we leave off? Yes, okay. So we were just reading how Dr. Tufekci had seen movement after movement falter because of a lack of organizational depth and experience, you remember this, or of tools or culture for collective decision-making and strategic long-term action. This is she had written in her book in 2017, Twitter and Tear Gas. And that was the same social media savvy that hastened their rise, sometimes left them unable to engage in the tactical and decision-making maneuvers all movements must master to survive. That's a lesson many social movements have learned since those days, and this summer's Black Lives Matter protests locked in some immediate political gains. Some in Silicon Valley are taking social science more seriously these days, too. The Twitter chief executive Jack Dorsey told me last fall if he had to do it all over again, he would have hired a social scientist to help design the service. One of the things that makes Dr. Tufekci stand out in this gloomy moment is her lack of irony or world weariness. She is not a prophet of doom, having hung on to an early internet optimism that she shares with the Craigslist founder, Craig Newmark, and a few others. That optimism is part of what got her into the literature of pandemics. Really. Dr. Tufekci has taught epidemiology as a way to introduce her students to globalization and to make a point about human nature. Politicians in the news media often expect looting and crime when disaster strikes, as they did when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005. But the reality on the ground has more to do with communal acts of generosity and kindness, she believes. Public health officials seem to have had an ulterior motive when they told citizens that masks were useless. They were trying to stave off a run on protective gear that could have made it unavailable for the healthcare workers who needed it. Dr. Tufekci's faith in human nature has led her to believe that the government should have trusted citizens enough to level with them, rather than jeopardize its credibility with recommendations it would later overturn. They didn't trust us to tell us the truth on masks, she said. We think of society as this Hobbesian thing, as opposed to the reality, where most people are very friendly. Most people are prone to solidarity. And I think she's largely right about that. I mean, my recollection of what happened once we found out that they did, in fact, require those masks for healthcare workers, and that we all would benefit one another from wearing by wearing masks. I think we figured out pretty quickly what ought to be done, and most people were, if not aggressively shaming those people who were appearing in public in N95 masks, at least pressing retailers to remove them from the shelves and donate, or at least sell them to healthcare workers and move them to their highest value. She was right about that. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue on with the reading of this profile of Zeynep Tufekci by, Ben Smith in New York Times. She's got a new cause now, and her new cause is ventilation. Her vehicle is the Atlantic, which gave her a contract after she had contributed to the Times as a freelancer for many years. Ironically, just as the Times opinion department was tearing itself apart over the charge that amplifying a senator's views could endanger protesters, we all remember who that was, Tom Cotton, and, he's purportedly, he's a senator. They say he won his election, right? Anyway, the one writer, ironically in all this, who had certainly saved lives, slipped out a side door. Her March column on masks was among the most influential the Times has published, although, or perhaps because, it lacked the political edge that brings wide attention to an opinion piece. Public health authorities are now listening to her. 2 months after her op-ed article, Dr. Rajkumar and Dr. Tufekci took part in a conference call with World Health Organization officials who were concerned that people who had gotten in the habit of wearing masks would think they were safe and start behaving recklessly. No, listen, I'm a sociologist. I know that's not true, Dr. Tufekci told them. Now I find myself wondering, what is she right about now? And what are the rest of us wrong about? Well, an area where she might be ahead of the pack is the effects of social media on society. It's a debate she views as worryingly binary, detached from plausible solutions, with journalists homing in on the personal morality of tech heads like Mark Zuckerberg as they assume the role of mall cops for the platforms they cover. The real question is not whether Zuck is doing what I like or not, she said. The real question is why he's getting to decide what hate speech is. She also suggested that we may get it wrong when we focus on individuals, on chief executives, on social media activists like her. The probable answer to a media environment that amplifies false reports and hate speech, she believes, is the return of functional governments. It's a tall order. But that, along with the birth of a new framework, another tall order, however imperfect, that will hold the digital platforms responsible for what they host. That's going to be a very different framework. It's charmed that I get to do this. It feels good, she said. But in the ideal world, people like me are kind of superfluous, and we have these faceless, nameless experts and bureaucrats who tell us, this is what you have to do. That is the end, and a rather confusing end, as it happens, to the article, but an interesting piece on an interesting person whose name just keeps cropping up all over the place, and I guess now we have some sense of why. It's very interesting, just this field of study that she's carved out for herself, and reminds me, too, since I have in mind our eldest, who we're bringing to college just today, who is at the moment an economics major, but has been intrigued in the past year or two with the study, I guess, an emerging sector of economics, behavioral economics, which I think would overlap an awful lot with where Tufekci is in her combination of sociology with sort of as a behavioral science, and overlapping that with her analysis of news events. And as a matter of fact, I think when what's his name from Twitter, who I only ever remember his first name because he just goes by Jack on Twitter, Jack Dorsey. Yes, when he was saying that he might want to have hired a social scientist to help design the service. I don't know if I read that article or not, but I think my recollection is that there was maybe some mention of the necessity of a behavioral economist. Yes, as a matter of fact, there it is, mentioned in the Twitter discussion to which he links here. This, though, a comment on Twitter from Jeff Jarvis saying, 2 years into Twitter, Jack says he wishes he'd have hired a social scientist, a behavioral economist, and a game theorist. He's hiring them now. When Jack and I discussed this, I suggested adding an anthropologist. Emily Bell next to me said, was that you? Awful idea. We disagree. Okay. But there we are with the mention of a behavioral economist. And I don't know if Jeff Jarvis is reporting on his own discussion or reporting on Ben's discussion. I guess back when he was BuzzFeed Ben. I think that's what's happening here. So, okay, very interesting. And I did bring that up and showed that to my son and said behavioral economics can get you involved in the design of online social media, to which he said, okay. He's not really much of a social media fan, though he is very much online and connected. Interesting to see what the next generation involves itself in, and where social media moves next. And he'll probably be able to tell you when his course of study is over. So we'll all ask him and then get some investment advice. He's not bad at that either, by the way. All right, moving on, or I guess back around. Maybe we can take a look at Virginia Heffernan's discussion over the weekend and take a peek in her article just to see what follows from that. Just sort of an interesting follow-up. I hadn't had this in mind, but that's the beauty of doing this show. Not only that, but the beauty of taping it ahead of time so that none of you can tweet me and try to make me stop. So how did I get around to this Virginia Heffernan article? Well, I happened to see her responding to a tweet from Jeff Yates, apparently a journalist, or rather, I suppose, a journaliste with Radio Canada. So, trying my best to figure out how that might be pronounced in French. He was reacting to the story that I believe we read a little bit about the other day from rightwingwatch.org, the Texas QAnon supporter who got in her car drunk, believing that it was her mission to go and take out some pedophiles, right? And we were all terrified by the fact that these idiots were taking up weaponry and makeshift weaponry to try and take out the pedophiles. I was mostly concerned with the possibility of putting one or more of them on the floor of Congress with members' pins that they could use to bypass security. Well, Jeff Yates was looking at this article and I guess pulled a quote from it saying, Molina claims to have introduced Fulbright to QAnon. This is the description, actually part of the article that we didn't read. Maybe we should have now, but this was part of the article in which friends of this woman who got into her car, whose last name is Fulbright, are describing how she came around to becoming a QAnon believer. And this friend of hers, Molina, this is her last name, claims to have introduced Fulbright to QAnon, saying, I was the one who originally sent her stuff. Kind of like laughing at how ridiculous it is, Molina said. Now I have my doubts. Maybe Molina is embarrassed about having done this. And looking back on it, I was really just doing it ironically to talk about how ridiculous it is. But according to Molina, this is not any further explored in the article. I'm just guessing. But according to Molina, Fulbright began to sincerely follow the conspiracy theory. And that grab from the article was picked up by Virginia here, who comments thus, when I played D&D and online RPGs in the early 1980s, there was much media alarmism that we'd start believing we were clerics and paladins and start walking off cliffs thinking we could fly. It seemed absurd. I even satirized that panic in Magic and Loss, which she encloses in quotes here, and I imagine is one of her published pieces. It seems it was justified. Then she goes on to say, I found this old piece about my misspent youth when I was confident online masquerade was an easy game that anyone could learn. Spotting leches, knowing an avatar is just an avatar, knowing not to murder the warlock in real life, right? But she says, I didn't foresee QAnon. And I just thought that was really kind of interesting. The article itself is about sort of learning to, it wasn't a learning experience, but just naturally picking up on what were the boundaries of conversation and interaction online and how to have it without putting yourself in danger, despite the fears from others that people wouldn't be able to discern fantasy from reality or online life from real life. And that never really actually became a concern for people in that age. And in many ways, not for most people now either, but the weird and susceptible few, with enough millions of people exposed to this thing, you're going to come up with a critical mass of people who can't tell the difference between online fakery and what's really happening in life. But then she cast the net open, just was asking other people, did you have the same experience? So I had to chime in and say yes, but it was really an interesting piece of invoking some of the other strange panics in the past. And that got me thinking the other day. I mean, and other people have chimed in about it too, about the weird recurrence of conspiracy theories about some strange aspect of life into which they accused Satan worshippers of creeping into. I was actually reminded of it by a tweet I saw the other day from Whitney Phillips, who I don't recognize, but Whitney Phillips has the profile mentioned here, Communications and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University, with a couple of books in print and occasionally writing at Wired magazine. And the tweet is accompanied by the NBC News article, one of the latest NBC News articles diving into the QAnon phenomenon. But the tweet says, I appreciate the context that the writers of this NBC piece bring to the discussion. Some additional historical context is helpful too, as the same thing, basically point by point, happened during the satanic panics of the 1980s and 90s. And it becomes a tweet thread where Whitney Phillips takes you through this. The panics first gathered energy in the 70s within evangelical circles, and through the 80s circulated within far-right distribution networks like churches and far-right radio networks, which were major hubs. The accusations that emerged in the 80s explicitly referred to Satanism and satanic ritual abuse. But as the accusations spread into more secular networks, and here referring to academic work that they've done here, Milner and Phillips, that is, tether to this network climate change, shifts in media and regulation and rise of far-right starting in the 70s, slow, then much faster changes in how info spreads. Some parenthetical comments here. Explicit references to Satan, though, began falling away. Sometimes this was the effort of evangelicals who knew that leading with Satan would alienate non-Christians, or Christians who didn't believe in the devil incarnate, and child welfare advocates, often evangelical, who wanted to get the word out, but again, knew Satan was a tough sell. But in other cases, Satan gave way to more secular framings like multi-victim, multi-offender abuse, or simply child sex rings, because the people hearing and reacting to the info didn't know where it originated or that Satan was ever a part of it. A boon for the far-right culture warriors. This is exactly what's happening here. Clearly there's subterfuge at play for many, an effort to launder QAnon into the mainstream by tethering it to one of the few things almost everyone can agree on: child sex abuse is terrible. What journalist would argue against that? But there are lots of people who see calls to protect the children and respond earnestly, inadvertently helping the QAnon cause, which, let's not forget, is also at the heart of so much COVID misinformation. Even if they've never heard of QAnon or don't know of its worst harms. The narrative parallels the satanic / deep state / QAnon theories, and the satanic panics are striking even just as a historical curio. The more things change, the more they say the same, is the comment here. But those parallels reveal much more than that. These theories spread across and between networks, accruing energy, credibility, and increasing numbers of sympathizers through a combination of bad faith media manipulation, good faith efforts to help, not realizing what you're even helping with, and totally neutral everyday actions. Understanding all the energies powering these kinds of conspiracy theories along and the accidental role we all might be playing is critical to assessing how, if, or when to respond to similar kinds of theories today. And then offering up, I guess, some of their own writing here. For more background on the panics, network climate change, interesting term, and how pushing back then, as now, only helped spread the theories into new networks, making the theories more powerful. See our, Milner and Phillips chapter from You Are Here, The Devils in the Deep Frames. Interesting. And a link here to the publication. And I thought, great point, and also a good entry point back into the QAnon story. But first, a diversion back to one of the satanic panics that I remember from my own experience growing up, and maybe you remember it too. It's happened more than once, and if you're old enough, you recognize it. And I did recognize it the other day in, again, in a Twitter discussion. This one too I want to dig up. But are you old enough? I'm asking all the wrong questions. Are you old enough to remember those days when I don't know who they were. Although then I found out who they were just recently, and that surprised me too. When whoever it was accusing Procter and Gamble. Yeah, I mean the major what personal goods manufacturer, hygiene products. I mean, I knew them from making like Crest toothpaste or something was the one that was in my house. But the Procter and Gamble was somehow connected to some sort of worldwide Satanist cabal because their logo was, they thought, a satanic, like some sort of secret satanic message. What it was, as I recall, some sort of crescent man in the moon and some stars. And they somehow thought that, I don't know whether that was supposed to be connected to witchcraft or something, because moon and stars, but I mean, the moon and stars is out there, and it's not witchcraft. But they got all worked up about it, and everyone kind of in mainstream America thought it was bizarre garbage. And oh my God, someone let the evangelicals out of the basement again. But we were just getting used to evangelicals for the first time, like realizing that there was this sector of Americans who, like back in the Salem days, just saw witchcraft and Satanism and everything, and somehow they had been revived as a weirdo sect. And then it became music lyrics and heavy metal music, and somehow that was more acceptable than accusing a major brand of dedication to Satanism. And I guess we should have known, maybe we didn't know just yet, how profound the Reagan and Republican influences had been on mainstream American thought. It's impossible for a giant corporation to be, well, certainly satanic, but evil, because after all, profit, yada yada, greed is good. And I guess it never really occurred to, but heavy metal music, those people with long hair, they're disgusting, and probably something, and it grew into a mainstream movement, and even Al Gore's wife got caught up in it, and that caused a lot of grief for a lot of people. Anyway, but I remember that happening, and I actually stopped to look that up on Wikipedia shortly thereafter, and guess what I found? There is a section in the larger article on Procter & Gamble on the logo myth. This is the one I remember, giving a little bit of background, and I'll just read you the whole section here. It's kind of intriguing. Procter & Gamble's former logo originated in 1851 as a crude cross that barge workers on the Ohio River painted on cases of P&G Star candles to identify them. P&G later, now this is where it becomes relevant, P&G later changed this symbol into a trademark that showed a man in the moon overlooking 13 stars, said to commemorate the original 13 colonies. Now, the company received unwanted media publicity in the 1980s. So what is this? This is 130 years later. In the 1980s, due to rumors spread largely by Amway distributors that the moon and stars logo was a satanic symbol. Now, before we get to how stupid it is to come around to the idea that this is a satanic symbol, can we just stop for a second? Amway distributors. Amway, of course, I guess, sold a lot of rival products to the P&G product portfolio. And, of course, I suppose one way of muscling in on their territory and selling their products directly to people, I guess you could get away with it in a kitchen table conversation between friends that, well, you don't want to buy Procter & Gamble's products, you want to buy Amway's products, because Procter & Gamble's products are financing Satanism. And no one wants that. And I don't know, I guess it worked. But how underhanded and sneaky is that? Amway distributors telling people, well, Procter & Gamble, the products you use, they're for Satanists, but ours are for good, clean, upstanding American Christians or whatever. Not to mention the fact that Amway, of course, is the DeVos company. In other words, Betsy DeVos's family and Eric Prince's company made their fortune by selling products that sales of which they boosted by starting rumors, allegedly, that that Procter & Gamble was satanic because of this moon and stars logo. I mean, I don't really remember the origin story of this crazy myth, but now this is amazing. And lo and behold, the scions of the DeVos family fortune now sit in positions of power inside our government, and we're once again somehow seeing the actual balance of political power in the country manipulated by yet another satanic panic. It worked last time, let's try it again. Just as starting rumors about Yulia Tymoshenko in Ukraine got her bounced out of the way, Paul Manafort decided maybe other rivals could be bounced out of the way by similarly generating false rumors about them in Ukraine. And the DeVos family says, I remember way back when we got our way and made millions of dollars by saying that satanic threats were looming. Let's try that again. Well, anyway, how dumb was the basis of the accusation? Recall, we have the man in the moon and the 13 stars said to represent the 13 original colonies. Very American. How wholesome, right? So the rumor mongers apparently started saying that based on a particular passage in the Bible, specifically Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, which states, "And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars." Now you might say, well, in the heavens there's a woman, and this is if anything, a man in the moon, and it's not a crown of 12 stars, but a bunch of stars, not at all arranged as a crown, and 13 of them at that. But no matter for these kinds of people. For the QAnon types, or people who later would become QAnon types, this sort of thing stands as no barrier. They'll unravel the clues for you. They'll unskew the polls. I forgot about that stupid controversy. This is a very similar thing in a way. What did they do? Well, they noticed that P&G's logo consisted of a man's face on the moon surrounded by 13 stars. Now, some claimed that the logo was in fact a mockery of the heavenly symbol alluded to in the aforementioned verse, thus construing the logo to be satanic. Where the flowing beard of the man in the moon meets the surrounding circle, 3 curls were said to be a mirror image of the number 666. That is to say, they curl the opposite direction, but it doesn't matter. If you look at it in a mirror, it could be a 666, and it really can't be. But okay, that's what they came up with. Instead of just writing 666, they wrote it backwards and upside down, which is so satanic. And so don't you get it? So here you are, the number 666, or of course a reflection in their minds of the number of the beast. And at the top and the bottom, the hair curls in on itself and was said to be the 2 horns like those of a ram. The moon and stars logo, as it turns out, was discontinued in 1985 in a failed attempt to quash those rumors. And I guess they never got rid of them entirely, but that's because Amway was making millions of dollars on them. These interpretations have been denied by company officials, of course, and no evidence linking the company to the Church of Satan or any other occult organization has ever been presented. The company unsuccessfully sued Amway from 1995 all the way through 2003 over these rumors forwarded through a company voicemail system in 1995. In 2007, the company successfully sued individual Amway distributors for reviving and propagating the false rumors. The Church of Satan, in the meantime, denies being supported by Procter & Gamble. So there you have it. None of these things match the words of the Bible passage, but that's because they're mocking the Bible passage, and they're really actually referring directly to it by referring to something completely different, but in mocking fashion. Isn't that fantastic? Can you believe that people go in for this stuff? Well, I guess they do, and while we can't believe it, apparently millions of people do, and these days I guess they do it in the form of believing in QAnon. I'm curious now, maybe the thing to do is to switch over to the NBC News article, which I had put aside anyway in Pocket to share with you. But the fact that Whitney Phillips refers to this article for kicking off the discussion of satanic panics makes me think maybe this is a good time to bring this article up after all. Of course, with our break just about coming up here, it might not be the best timing to bring it up, but let's get started on it and then perhaps read a paragraph or two. This is the article's entitled "Q Anon Looms Behind Nationwide Rallies and Viral Hashtag Save the Children." Rallies planned on Facebook by QAnon supporters or sympathizers that have brought the conspiracy theory offline and into the town squares of dozens of cities in recent weeks. Now, the focus of this piece is Brandy Zadrozny and Ben Collins, the writers behind this, and apparently they've been digging into QAnon for quite some time. And, well, here's what they've turned up lately. On the second Saturday of August, about 100 protesters gathered at the Big Red Wagon, a well-known attraction in downtown Spokane, Washington. Men, women, and children marched through the streets chanting, "Save the children." It was ostensibly an effort to raise awareness and start a conversation about child trafficking, according to a local television reporter at the scene. We'll find out how much more it was about after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Okay, so let's continue on with this NBC News piece about QAnon. Many of the marchers held signs that would be expected at such a rally. "Save our kids," "Your silence is deafening," and "Wake up for our children," to name a few. But other signs were less clear and suggested that something darker was going on during an event that otherwise seemed organic and sympathetic. "Symbolism will be their downfall," one read. Another featured the hashtag pedowood, which is ambiguous, to say the least. Yet another was a strange acronym, WWG1WGA, short, of course, for "Where we go one, we go all," the Q Anon Mantra. These signs, similar to those found at many such rallies now taking place around the U.S., are references to QAnon, the conspiracy theory that has surged in popularity in recent months. It turned out that the rally had nothing to do with the century-old humanitarian charitable group Save the Children. QAnon is a sprawling and baseless conspiracy theory alleging that President Donald Trump is engaged in a secret war against a cabal of Satanist child abusers in government, entertainment, and the media. The conspiracy, which has spread to millions of users in Facebook groups during the pandemic, where people were locked away and reading anything they get their hands on, I guess, has been linked to several violent crimes and was last year labeled a potential domestic terror threat by the FBI. Not that Trump cares about domestic terror threats, of course. The scene in Spokane was just one of many rallies planned on Facebook by QAnon supporters or sympathizers that have brought the conspiracy theory offline and into the town squares of dozens of cities in recent weeks. On Saturday, more than 200 Save the Children events were scheduled to take place across the country, organized by a constellation of individuals and newly formed groups, according to an NBC News analysis of Facebook events. The events themselves tend to follow a familiar pattern. People march along the main streets and chant, usually sticking to the broader topics of child abuse and human trafficking. When talking with local reporters, marchers rarely mention QAnon or wider conspiracy theories, sticking instead to demands like stricter laws against pedophilia and greater media attention on sex trafficking. The marchers are neighborly and peaceful. Often young children are marching too, wearing T-shirts emblazoned with bloody handprints and carrying tiny signs with messages like, "I am not for sale." QAnon spent years on the fringes of the internet, with the theory evolving and often growing less specific. What was originally a conspiracy theory that centered on an anonymous internet poster has now become something of a catch-all for a variety of beliefs about a hidden group of child abusers in positions of power. That's helped create a palatable entry point for many people who might not spend much time in the dark parts of the internet but are active on Facebook. It's a strategy that has led to a significant growth in people who might not necessarily be among the most ardent QAnon diehards, but are beginning to warm to some of its ideas. This is not about pedophilia, said Whitney Phillips. That's how the article got linked up with this thing, I guess. An assistant professor of communications and rhetorical studies at Syracuse University and co-author of the book, You Are Here, a field guide for navigating polarized speech, conspiracy theories, and our polluted media landscape. This is not about child protection. This is about conspiracy theory, a conspiracy theory that's trying to couch itself in other terms to get more people involved and sympathetic. And those sympathetic people are showing up at rallies and trying to take action. People who have spent years working for organizations that fight human trafficking for real and child abuse say that they have been flooded by bizarre claims and tips, as well as criticism and sometimes threats. In early August, the hashtag Save the Children seemed to be everywhere. As it spiked, Facebook briefly disabled the hashtag with a warning that it went against community standards. That action poured gasoline on the Q Anon community, which rallied to circumvent what they claimed in groups was censorship. The hashtag was reinstated and continued to take off, but lost steam when QAnon believers moved to Save Our Children, that is Save Our Children, hashtag, after realizing Save the Children, the humanitarian organization founded in 1999. What warned them off of it? It was funded in part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And, of course, Bill Gates has been a constant target of unfounded conspiracy theories spread by QAnon groups since the coronavirus pandemic began. The nonprofit organization Save the Children did not respond to a request for comment, while 3.5 million users across thousands of groups were talking about Save the Children has a hashtag, and the hashtag Save Our Children by Friday, according to Facebook data. The most engaging conversations were happening in Facebook groups and on Instagram accounts related to QAnon, according to an analysis by First Draft, a nonprofit that tracks misinformation online and provides research and training for journalists. QAnon groups make up only 18% of those posting about hashtag Save Our Children, but they accounted for nearly 70% of the total interactions on the hashtag in August, according to First Draft. On Instagram, QAnon-related accounts posting about Save Our Children accounted for 75% of the interactions. Most of the top hashtags from Save Our Children posts in August are QAnon specific. The data suggests that a relatively small number of QAnon-related Facebook groups and Instagram accounts were able to amplify and co-opt Save Our Children and its related language by creating a large and unprecedented flurry of posts and activity around the hashtag, said Rory Smith, the research manager at First Draft who wrote the analysis. Facebook cracked down on QAnon on last Wednesday, removing or restricting more than 13,000 groups, pages, and Instagram accounts that pushed QAnon content and discussed potential violence. That action did not seem to affect the rallies planned for last weekend, events that largely remain on Facebook, or at least the planning remains on Facebook for people to follow. A Facebook spokesperson told NBC News that the company was continuing to review QAnon content against the new policy, including Save the Children events. Now, the next section, organized and active. I forgot the title of the last section there, but sometimes it's best just to skip right past them and get to the story itself. While many of the Save the Children events do not openly espouse QAnon beliefs, the group's connection is never far. On their personal social media pages and in their mostly private Facebook groups, organizers of the largest upcoming rallies openly embrace QAnon ideology and push its content. Facebook pages for the events are often swarmed with conspiracy theories involving vast child trafficking rings and baseless accusations about the involvement of Hollywood actors and politicians. Scotty Rojas, a musician and social media manager who goes by Scotty the Kid, was the force behind an Instagram campaign to rally protesters in 100 cities on August 22nd. Rojas organized one of the first rallies, a July 31st march in Hollywood, that ended with dozens of people with signs with messages that included "Hillary Clinton is Satan," and others fashioned into pizza slices, a reference to Pizzagate, of course, the unfounded claim that the child trafficking ring is being led out of a Washington pizzeria. Storming a CNN building, also apparently one of the end results of this thing. It's a kind of a weird construction to that sentence. Rojas led the rally wearing a T-shirt with a large Q emblazoned on the front and carried a bullhorn through which he led chants of QAnon cries like "Where we go one, we go all." Shauna Blen, a California activist behind a team effort to unite hundreds of Saturday's rallies, noted the heavy presence of QAnon believers at the previous rallies, but said all were welcome. There were a lot of Trump supporters, a lot of Q supporters, she said, but there were also a lot of Democrats and people that do not like Trump and don't even follow Q. As for her personal stance, Blen said, "I guess you could say I support Q." Other organizers were less willing to claim QAnon, but unwilling to deny it. Amy Kuhn and Isaac Miller are founders of Where's Our Children? That's a grammatical error, isn't it? A new Nashville-based organization, and planners of more than 25 rallies for next Saturday, this one upcoming, August 29th. They said they were working to clean up the descriptions for the rallies, many of which contained hashtags belonging to the QAnon conspiracy. "Every person is going to have their own freedoms and beliefs," Miller said of the marchers. When asked whether the organization believes that Pizzagate is real, echoing one of the hashtags of its many events, Kuhn demurred. "We will neither confirm nor deny that," Kuhn said. That's a yes. One group that formed in July, Freedom for the Children, has organized more than 60 rallies in 26 states and Canada. Not immune to this either. According to their website, maybe they're lying, where they accept donations. Until Wednesday, personal Facebook profiles for the co-founders, Bhairavi, B-H-A-I-R, Bhairavi Shira, and Tara Nicole, seen by NBC News, contained posts with conspiracy theories about Bill Gates, the coronavirus, and QAnon's precursor, Pizzagate. By Thursday, Shira's personal profile had either been removed or deleted, and Nicole deleted or made previous posts private. Shira and Nicole did not respond to a request for comment. Their communication strategy seems to be working. Regardless of their public online postings and event pages, local media coverage of the events has been widespread and credulous, almost never mentioning the event's QAnon connections. A few local television and radio stations have advertised lists of the events on their news websites. The Colorado Times Recorder served as an outlier with its report last week. Denver anti-child sex trafficking march rooted in QAnon conspiracy theories. They actually just came out and said it. All 6 of the rally organizers who spoke with NBC News said the point of their protests was to get media attention. Indeed, many of the signs seen at rallies ask why the media is reporting on COVID-19 or Black Lives Matter protests instead of the real pandemic of missing children. It's a tactic that can help attract more followers. The media often acts as an interlocutor between movements and politicians, said Joan Donovan, director of Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy. And media attention can also be a strong recruitment strategy. Next section here, we're leaving those kids behind. People who have spent much of their lives fighting human trafficking and child abuse have borne the brunt of the surge in popularity from Save the Children's movement. Rochelle Keehan, the CEO of the anti-trafficking nonprofit Collective Liberty, has been bombarded in the last few months with text messages, Facebook messages, and LinkedIn requests, all pointing her to conspiracy theories and YouTube videos about satanic cabals. She mostly gets sent a 10-part YouTube video about how Trump is secretly rounding up all of the Satanists and in turn stopping child trafficking. Keehan is a former prosecutor of gender-based crimes for the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. She designed a Disruption Strategies Division at the anti-trafficking organization Polaris. She said the incoming messages are incessant. They're like, have you seen this? What are you doing about this? She said, all day, every day. We're doing a lot about this. Before QAnon adherents took over the Save the Children hashtag, QAnon followers invented the conspiracy theory that the furniture site Wayfair was trafficking missing children in overpriced shelves and pillows last month. Yes, really. Kian's group, which was inundated with Wayfair tips, put out a statement explaining that the exorbitant prices were due to search engine optimization gone wrong and not proof of a satanic cabal. So did Polaris, which was forced to put out a statement hoping QAnon followers would stop sending in false Wayfair tips. While Polaris treats all calls to the trafficking hotline seriously, the extreme volume of these contacts has made it more difficult for the trafficking hotline to provide support and attention to others who are in need of help, the company said. Kian said these conspiracy theories often wildly misrepresent what trafficking most frequently looks like, which can make it harder for real victims to get help. Their kid's friend could have all the warning signs of those same girls that Epstein victimized, Keehan said, referring to Jeffrey Epstein, of course, the millionaire financier who was accused of federal sex trafficking. If we're not paying attention to that, then we're leaving those kids behind and letting them fall into the hands of predators. And that's also the worry of Eliza, a human trafficking victim who now works in aftercare for trafficking survivors. Her last name is being withheld to protect her identity from former abusers. There's nothing more terrifying to me as an advocate than thinking about a survivor not being able to get through to the human trafficking hotline or National Human Trafficking Hotline because it is being inundated with Wayfair calls, she said. Eliza, who is hosting a virtual event on Saturday with survivors who were abused by Epstein, was initially disheartened by QAnon supporters drowning out real calls to action and stop child sex trafficking, and said she considered ending her efforts due to constant misinformation. Although Eliza is hopeful that the new surge of attention can raise awareness among people who want to stop real-world human trafficking, the picture of sex trafficking painted by QAnon's version of Save the Children campaign does not tend to reflect reality, she said. We do run into this issue where we see the imagery of little white girls with chains on, and just speaking from personal experience, I did not step forward sooner. This is me speaking as a survivor, because I thought I hadn't been transported in the back of a semi-truck, Eliza said. I wasn't aware of what human trafficking meant, that is to say, in the real sense. So very interesting. Even victims of human trafficking sometimes get, I guess, sort of backhandedly gaslit out of believing that they were a victim of real human sex trafficking because it doesn't match the stupid fantasy made-up picture that QAnon and other weirdos put up around the internet to convince people that their stupid theories are true. Imagine that. Just the interference in breaking up real trafficking networks is just heartbreaking. But close behind, of course, is the heartbreak of finding out that millions of Americans have fallen into this cult for no reason other than somebody thought it would be a real funny joke to see how far they could push this stuff. Well, at this point, maybe the thing to do is to continue on with the writing of Brandy Zadrozny and Ben Collins, writing a few days earlier for NBC News. This one on August 14th, again about the Q issue and what the hell is it and where did it come from. Digging a little bit deeper into who's supposedly behind it. And here, this story thinks they've drilled down a little bit on it. And I mentioned yesterday that there were some rumors circulating about some involvement of the 8chan founder behind this as well. So it's not entirely nailed down at this point, but this is I think this is the most credible reporting in a mainstream traditional media press source so far. How three conspiracy theorists took Q and sparked QAnon. Pushing the theory on to bigger platforms proved to be the key to QAnon's spread and the originators' financial gain. It should surprise no one that there was financial gain involved here. Again, NBC News reporting this on August 14th. In November of 2017, a small-time YouTube video creator and two moderators of the 4chan website, one of the most extreme message boards on the internet, banded together and plucked out of obscurity an anonymous and cryptic post from the many conspiracy theories that populated the website's message board. Over the next several months, they would create videos, a Reddit community, a business, and an entire mythology based off the 4chan posts of Q, the pseudonym of a person claiming to be a high-ranking military officer. The theory they espoused would become QAnon and would eventually make its way from those message boards to national media stories and the rallies of President Donald Trump. Now, the people behind that effort are at the center of a fractious debate among conspiracy enthusiasts, some of whom believe the three people who first popularized the QAnon theory are promoting it in order to make a living. I don't know whether that disturbs them or not, but I guess some of them anyway. Others suggest that these original followers actually wrote Q's mysterious posts. While the identity of the original author or authors behind Q is still unknown, the history of the conspiracy theory's spread is well documented through YouTube videos, social media posts, Reddit archives, and public records reviewed by NBC News. NBC News has found that the theory can be traced back to three people who sparked some of the first conversation about QAnon and, in doing so, attracted followers who they then asked to help fund QAnon, quote, research. QAnon is, of course, a convoluted conspiracy theory with no apparent foundation in reality. The heart of it asserts that for the last year, the anonymous Q has taken to the fringe internet message boards of 4chan and 8chan to leak intelligence about Trump's top-secret war with a cabal of criminals run by politicians like Hillary Clinton and the Hollywood elite. There is no evidence for these claims, though there is evidence that you have to be kind of crazy to believe them. In addition to peeking into the mainstream, the theory has been increasingly linked to real-world violence. In recent months, QAnon followers have allegedly been involved in a foiled presidential assassination plot. I'm not even sure why that would come up. A devastating California wildfire, and an armed standoff with local law enforcement officers in Arizona, all linked here in case you want to investigate what those are about. Part of the QAnon appeal lies in its game-like quality. Followers wait for clues left by Q on the message board. When the clues appear, believers dissect the riddle-like posts alongside Trump's speeches and tweets and news articles in an effort to validate the main narrative that Trump is winning a war against evil. There are now dozens of commentators who dissect Q posts on message boards, in YouTube videos, and on their personal pages, but the theory was first championed by a handful of people who worked together to stir discussion of the Q posts, eventually pushing the theory on to bigger platforms and gaining followers, a strategy that proved to be the key to QAnon's spread and the originator's financial gain. Now on to this section, the Anons. Before Q, there was a wide variety of Anon 4chan posters, all claiming to have special government access. In 2016, there was FBI Anon, a self-described high-level analyst and strategist, offering intel about the 2016 investigation into the Clinton Foundation. Then came HLI Anon, the acronym for High-Level Insider, who posted about various dubious conspiracies and riddles, including one that claimed Princess Diana had been killed because she found out about 9/11 beforehand and had tried to stop it. The CIA Anon and CIA intern took to the boards in early 2017, and last August, one called WH, like White House Insider Anon, offered a supposed preview of something that was, quote, going to go down regarding the DNC and leaks. QAnon was just another unremarkable part of the Anon genre until November of 2017, when two moderators from the 4chan board where Q posted predictions, who went by the usernames Pamphlet Anon and Baruch the Scribe, reached out to Tracy Diaz. According to Diaz's blogs and YouTube videos, Baruch the Scribe, in reality a self-identified web programmer from South Africa named Paul Ferber, confirmed that account to NBC News. A bunch of us decided that the message needed to go wider, so we contacted YouTubers who had been commenting on the Q drops, Ferber said in an email. Diaz, a small-time YouTube star who once hosted a talk show on the fringe right-wing network Liberty Movement Radio, had found moderate popularity with a couple of thousand views for her YouTube videos analyzing WikiLeaks releases and discussing the Pizzagate conspiracy, a baseless theory, of course, that alleged a child sex ring was being run out of a Washington pizza shop. As Diaz tells it, in a blog post detailing her role in the early days of QAnon, she banded together with the two moderators. Their goal, according to Diaz, was to build a following for QAnon, which would mean bigger followings for them as well. On November 3rd, 2017, just 6 days after the first 4chan post from Q, Diaz posted a video entitled /Paul Q Clearance Anon. Is it happening? #happening, 3 question marks. Don't even know what the hell she's getting at with that title, in which she introduced the conspiracy theory to her audience. I do not typically do videos like this, she said, but citing Q's, quote, very specific and kind of eerie, unquote, posts, Diaz explained that she would be covering the 4chan posts just in case this stuff turns out to be legit, because honestly, it seems kind of legit. That video, which has been viewed nearly 250,000 times, made Diaz one of the earliest people to seize on Q posts and decipher them for a conspiracy-hungry audience. Diaz followed with dozens more Q-themed videos, each containing a call for viewers to donate through links to her Patreon and PayPal accounts. Hey, that sounds familiar. Diaz's YouTube channel now boasts more than 90,000 subscribers, and her videos have been watched over 8 million times. More than 97,000 people follow her on Twitter. Diaz, who emerged from bankruptcy in 2009, says in her YouTube videos that she now relies on donations from patrons funding her YouTube, quote, research as her sole source of income. Diaz declined to comment on this story. Because I cover Q, I got an audience, Diaz acknowledged in a video that NBC News reviewed last week before she deleted it. Next section here, building a movement. To reach a more mainstream audience, older people and, quote, normies, right, who on their own would have trouble navigating the fringe message boards, Diaz said in a blog post she recommended they move to the more user-friendly Reddit. Archives listing the three as original posters and moderators show they created a new Reddit community called CBTS Stream, short for Calm Before the Storm, where, Calm Before the Storm Stream, where subscribers soon gathered to talk all things Q. Though there were no things, but okay, they wanted to talk about them. Their move to Reddit was key to QAnon's eventual spread. There, they were able to tap into a larger audience of conspiracy theorists and drive discussion with their analysis of each Q post. From there, QAnon crept to Facebook, where it found a new, older audience via dozens of public and private groups. That audience then started to head to 8chan to check out the original source and interact directly with the posts. Q posts moved from 4chan to its more toxic offshoot 8chan in November after a post claiming the original board had been, quote, infiltrated. Yikes, scary, right? 8chan became notorious for having no rules and even hosting child pornography. 8chan's owner's official Twitter account marveled at the influx of older, less internet-savvy visitors to his site, drawn by QAnon. We joked about it for years, but QAnon is making it a reality. Boomers! On your image board. Meanwhile, Diaz kept making videos, racking up hundreds of thousands of views. Over the next several months, Diaz and the two moderators picked up tens of thousands of followers on Reddit and YouTube, and added even more moderators to their 8chan and Reddit boards. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, that are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. We're continuing with the reading of this NBC News piece, yet another one about how the QAnon conspiracy took off on the web. And we left off just by noting that our three participants here, Diaz and the two 4chaners, the YouTuber Diaz, launched their effort and were amazed to see how much traction they were getting. And, of course, same thing on 8chan when they moved over to there. They also began to break into what might be considered the mainstream of the conspiracy world, if there is such a thing. Conspiracy theorist Dr. Jerome Corsi. We've heard his name before. An InfoWars editor and a best-selling author of books about the deep state. Maybe best-selling, who knows. You can claim that title in a number of ways. Had taken an interest in Q and was decoding the messages on the Reddit board. In December, Pamphlet Anon and Baruch the Scribe, the two 4chaners, even made an appearance on InfoWars. Corsi has since disavowed the QAnon conspiracy and called the current Q poster a fraud, citing a supposed takeover of the channel by someone posing as Q in April. But last week, facing backlash from his base, Corsi tweeted that he supports the QAnon movement and its supporters' excellent research. Soon, as Diaz explained on her blog, their expanding crew was spending all their waking hours in chat rooms on the gaming-focused forum Discord, analyzing and decoding Q messages and planning for a larger dissemination of Q's message. In March, their Reddit board, which boasted some 20,000 subscribers, was shut down by Reddit for, quote, encouraging or inciting violence and posting personal and confidential information, unquote. And the moderators, Diaz and the rest, were banned from the site. Ferber had already been booted from the site for allegedly threatening to reveal the personal details of another user and was pushed out of the private Q discussion groups he had helped form. I was very definitely banished, Ferber said, noting that he believes Q's board has been taken over by imposters. Seems like a recurring theme with these guys. By then, Pamphlet Anon, whose real name is Coleman Rogers, had developed grander plans. NBC was able to determine Rogers' identity through property records that link the address where his business is registered to his parents' home. No surprise there. And to photos from his personal social media account. Those photos show him to be the same person who appears on YouTube as Pamphlet Anon. Rogers did not respond to calls seeking comment, but acknowledged his receipt of messages from NBC News via his website's Twitter, writing in part, "We do not talk to fake news." Next up, network effect. Kicked off Reddit, Rogers hatched a new plan. He would replace the mainstream media, often a target of Q's posts, with a constantly streaming YouTube network made up of the self-described researchers who were putting together Q's clues. Within a month, Rogers, 31, and his wife, Christina Urso, 29, had launched the Patriots Soapbox, around-the-clock live-streamed YouTube channel for QAnon study and discussion. The channel is, in effect, a broadcast of a Discord chat room with constant audio commentary from a rotating cast of volunteers and moderators with sporadic appearances by Rogers and Urso. In April, Urso registered Patriots Soapbox LLC in Virginia, actually uncomfortably close to what I once thought we might be able to do with Daily Kos Radio. But okay. Rogers and Urso used their channel to call for donations that are accepted through PayPal, cryptocurrencies, or mail. It was a natural progression for Rogers. A review of Rogers' Facebook page shows he had been active in internet politics and a staunch supporter of Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign, self-identifying as part of the meme war, the creation and dissemination of images and internet-style commentary that internet agitators on the Chans and Reddit credit with Trump's win. Rogers often posted memes about liberal tears, as well as the ludicrous claims that Democrats murdered children and worshipped Satan, details similar to those that would eventually form the QAnon theory. Rogers' Facebook updates waned after Trump took office, but started up again in the fall when he began posting Q messages to both confused and supportive family and friends. Rogers has publicly denied that he's the author of the Q posts, though his last visible Facebook post, published on August 2nd, hinted that he might someday be associated with the theory. $10 says you see my face on national news within a few weeks, saying that I'm the mysterious hacker known as QAnon, Rogers wrote, a reference to a CNN segment that mistakenly referred to the website 4chan as a hacker. Following a request for comment from NBC News, Rogers deleted every post in his Facebook profile after 2014. Following another message from a reporter informing him that NBC News had archived his page, he deleted his Facebook account entirely. Next up, tables turned. As QAnon picked up steam, growing skepticism over the motives of Diaz, Rogers, and other early QAnon supporters led some in the internet's conspiracy circles to turn their paranoia on the group. It always eventually happens, I think. Recently, some QAnon followers have accused Diaz and Rogers of profiting from the movement by soliciting donations from their followers. Other pro-Trump online groups have questioned the roles that Diaz and Rogers have played in promoting Q, pointing to a series of slip-ups that they say show Rogers and Diaz may have been involved in the theory from the start. Those accusations have led Diaz and Rogers to both deny that they are Q and say they don't know who Q is. There is no direct proof that the group or any individual members are behind it. Still, QAnon skeptics, and isn't that just everybody, but I guess QAnon inside skeptics, have pointed to two videos as evidence that Rogers had insider knowledge of Q's account. Some YouTube channels, like one named Unirock, are mostly dedicated to poring over Patriots' soapbox live streams and dissecting purported slip-ups. One archived live stream appears to show Rogers logging into the 8chan account of Q. The Patriots' soapbox feed quickly cuts out after the login attempt. Sorry, leg cramp, Rogers says before the feed reappears seconds later. Okay, users in the associated chat room begin to wonder if Rogers had accidentally revealed his identity as Q. How did you post as Q? One user wrote. In another live-streamed video, Rogers begins to analyze the supposed Q post on his live-stream program when his co-host points out that the post in question doesn't actually appear on Q's feed and was authored anonymously. Rogers' explanation, the Q must have forgotten to sign in before posting, was criticized as extremely unlikely by people familiar with the message boards, as it would require knowledge of the posting to pick it out of hundreds of other anonymous ones. You see? Okay, I get your point. How did he know that it was Q? How did you focus on that one? In part because of the mounting claims against Patriots Soapbox, the web's largest pro-Trump community has banned all mentions of QAnon. Reddit's 640,000 member community, r/the Donald, set up an auto-delete function for mentions of QAnon's claims Two moderators confirmed to NBC News, believing the group of YouTubers is making posts as Q. Still, Patriot's Soapbox 24-hour live stream remains live on YouTube, broadcasting to its 46,000 subscribers. And despite the growing skepticism of the group, they still have their supporters who ardently believe in the QAnon theory. The funniest thing about those who try to discredit Q, they focus on whether Q is real or not, instead of on the information being provided, tweeted one follower. No one cares who Q is. We care about the truth. Sure, and why not? That's what everybody cares about. Okay, that's actually the end of the article, and I think I can scrounge up a reference at least to the other theory. Oh yeah, here it is. Brianna Wu, executive director of Rebellion PAC and a former candidate for U.S. House in Massachusetts. I don't think I put all that together, but Brianna Wu, a blue checkmark type person, tweeting yesterday, I don't know where it goes to, but this is what she had to say. We need for it to be verified by reputable sources, but there is compelling evidence. Are you compelled yet? I'll tell you what it is. Compelling evidence that Jim Watkins, the owner of 8chan, is in fact QAnon, which would mean functionally that the man that runs the Gamergate birthplace now has a cult of millions. I hope the media will investigate. And just goes on to mention here in her second tweet here that 8chan was responsible for Gamergate. You remember that one? 8chan was responsible for the Christchurch massacre. 8chan targets federal judges. 8chan traffics in stolen dark web credit card information and child pornography. If true, this is a truly terrifying development, but we're still stuck at the if true stage. Just thought I'd tell you at least what people are thinking about, if not able to prove. That, coupled with the NBC News article, I think, interesting background, to say the least. More time than I really wanted to spend on Q, but am I done? I'm not really sure. Well, we did make mention of the fact that some in law enforcement were now willing to see QAnon adherents and supporters as potential domestic terrorism threats, and I mentioned that there was another article that I thought might make a good follow-up to that. We've got the time. Let's pick this one up from Politico. The title, they're running it here, under here, they tried to get Trump to care about right-wing terrorism. He ignored them. Sounds pretty familiar. Subheader tells us that officials at the Department of Homeland Security waged a years-long internal struggle to get the White House to pay attention to the threat of violent domestic extremists. Frustrated, they gave up on the Trump administration, and I think we all should, quite honestly. This is Betsy Woodruff Swan putting this piece together for Politico, and I think not only in light of what we learned about QAnon, but in light of what's going on in Kenosha right now, and this lunatic kid who decided to start taking pot shots into the crowd and killed people, maybe right-wing extremism and domestic terrorism ought to be right back in focus. I mean, we've always known that it ought to be the focus. Maybe it will create some political pressure that even the Trump administration can't ignore, although it creates the equally disturbing possibility that this shooter will find himself invited to address the Republican convention on the last night. All right, but taking things seriously, although that could seriously happen, let's read this article. Elizabeth Newman, it's Neumann. I'm assuming they go with Newman and not Neumann, spent March 13th and 14th of 2019 at a conference in the picturesque Spanish port city of Malaga. The topic, terrorism. Western leaders were deeply worried about the dangers foreign terrorist fighters traveling back from places like Iraq, Libya, and Syria would pose to their home countries. And that's what Newman expected to dominate the two-day event. Newman was DHS's Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy at the time, handling counterterrorism work from the Department of Homeland Security's headquarters. In Malaga, a history-drenched resort town on Spain's Costa del Sol that once marked the fault line between the Muslim and Christian worlds, she and her counterparts from scores of countries spent long hours talking about the terrorism threats that concerned them most. After a while, she began to see a pattern. Though concerns about instability in the Middle East dominated the public discussions on counterterrorism, about 80% of the leaders at the conference ranked far-right extremism among their top concerns. The next morning, when Newman woke up early to catch a cab to the airport, her phone started lighting up with news alerts. A gunman had murdered 51 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Prosecutors would later say the killer planned the attack to maximize casualties and terrify the Muslim community and non-European immigrants. 5 months later, an American terrorist would cite him as an inspiration. I thought, oh my gosh, it's happening now, Newman recalled in an interview. For Newman, her nightmare scenario of globalized white supremacist terrorism was coming to life. Meanwhile, the U.S. government was doing far too little about its own homegrown extremists, often lone wolves, radicalized online by white supremacist websites and fueled by hostility toward immigrants and minorities. But White House officials didn't want to talk about the rising domestic extremist threat or even use the phrase domestic terrorism. The administration's relentless, single-minded focus on immigration enforcement, coupled with nonstop turnover on the National Security Council, constantly pulled senior DHS leadership away from everything else. And her ultimate boss, President Donald Trump, was part of the problem. This story is based on background and on-record interviews with current and former law enforcement officials, inside and outside DHS. It includes, for the first time, detailed comments from two top former political appointees in the department who tried to tackle the problem before giving up on the Trump administration. Frustrated by the president's failure to act, they are actively supporting his opponent. At least in this administration, Newman said, there's not going to be anything substantive done on domestic terrorism. The Department of Homeland Security is one of the federal government's biggest, newest, and unhappiest departments. It was created amid the ashes of the September 11th terror attacks as part of the government's efforts to, as its name suggests, secure the U.S. homeland. It became something of the island of lost agencies, holding everything from the Secret Service to immigration and customs enforcement to the Coast Guard under its massive umbrella. Only the Pentagon and the Department of Veterans Affairs have more employees, and the 230,000 employees at DHS consistently report miserable morale. In the agency's misery, Donald Trump saw opportunity. During the 2016 campaign, he touted the support of unions representing immigration and customs enforcement officers and Border Patrol agents. And after his inauguration, DHS was one of his first stops. He gave a major speech, as he says, a major speech. I can't hear that otherwise, but in his voice. He gave a major speech at its sprawling headquarters in Northwest D.C. just 5 days into his administration, highlighting his focus on the department's immigration and border security missions. It was hot as hell in the gym because there were so many people, a former DHS official recalled. People were excited. There was a moment of DHS isn't going to be last on the list. But being at the top of Trump's list also brought immense challenges for DHS leaders, namely trying to amp up immigration enforcement enough to keep the White House happy while also managing the department's panoply of other missions. Just a few weeks into the new administration, DHS leaders noticed an alarming trend, a burst of vandalism at Jewish cemeteries in Philadelphia, Rochester, New York, and University City, Missouri. We were all scratching our heads saying, "What is this?" Newman said. You could sense that something about the threat was changing and morphing, but we couldn't quite put our fingers on it until Charlottesville. On August 11th, 2017, scores of young white men carrying tiki torches marched through the campus of the University of Virginia chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and "White Lives Matter," in a public display of white supremacist mobilization that shocked and sickened the country. The next day, counter-protesters thronged the streets of Charlottesville to push back, and a white supremacist drove a car through that crowd, injuring 19 people and killing a woman named Heather Heyer. Trump's infamous response to the weekend You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. It could have been a moment of action from the federal government, Newman said, a chance for a systematic White House review of the threat's scope and causes, but it wasn't. Sadly, the president botched his response, and it became much more about what the president said and how he botched it than it was about what just happened, Newman lamented. This is not the America we know. We all had this collective, what in the world? How was this happening in 2017? John Kelly, a gruff 4-star general, was leading the department at the time. 3 months later, and just 6 months into his presidency, Trump fired Reince Priebus as chief of staff and replaced him with Kelly. Elaine Duke, then the department's second-in-command, stepped in as acting DHS chief for a few months, and then the Senate confirmed Kirstjen Nielsen. As the senior leadership merry-go-round played out, the president's demands for more deportations and fewer illegal border crossings stayed as high as ever. Trump often expressed irritation when he saw the DHS secretary anywhere other than the border. Miles Taylor, who was Nielsen's chief of staff, told Politico Trump used to lambaste her if she didn't physically spend enough of her time there. Verbatim, the president said, "Get your ass to the border. Why are you not down there?" Taylor said. Another former DHS official who requested anonymity to discuss the president's comments said Trump once fumed when he learned Nielsen was in Europe working on cybersecurity issues, even though cybersecurity is one of DHS's many core missions. "Why isn't she on the border?" the official recalled Trump saying. Senior DHS officials said they dealt with two constants from the White House: constant pressure to deliver on immigration and constant chaos. When you are spending all your energy preventing him from doing something illegal, then you can't also run your State Department or your Defense Department or your DHS, Newman said, highlighting the challenges Trump presented to cabinet secretaries. So you're relying heavily on the people underneath you. Try to do your jobs as well as possible while we protect you from the chaos. But everyone in the system is experiencing the same thing. For instance, the Senate-confirmed General Counsel for DHS, John Mitnick, reportedly warned the White House in February 2019 that a proposal to release undocumented immigrants into so-called sanctuary cities could get DHS sued for due process violations. In a 2019 town hall meeting with a group of DHS lawyers, according to a source present, one attendee asked Mitnick what his biggest challenge was. His answer: finding time to work on anything other than immigration and border security. During the same event, Mitnick told attendees that they should inform their supervisors immediately if anyone ever pressured them to greenlight an illegal action or policy, and he promised to support them. Later that year, Mitnick was fired. Early in Nielsen's tenure as secretary, she and Taylor discussed the domestic terror threat at length. In the months before her confirmation, a far-right extremist named Jeremy Christian had murdered 2 men on a train after harassing 2 black teenage girls. One of the girls wore a hijab, according to news reports, and Christian yelled, well, in his own words, F Muslims at them. Just days after Nielsen was confirmed, a man with a swastika marking on his leg murdered 2 students at a high school in New Mexico before killing himself. I said, look, this is a pretty big deal right now. It's getting serious. A lot of it's racially motivated, Taylor recalled telling Nielsen. I don't think we are well positioned against this. We've got to do more, but it's really got to start with the president. Oh well. At the time, then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster was overseeing the drafting of a new national counterterrorism strategy. The document would lay out priorities for using resources from across the U.S. government to combat terrorism. Taylor wrote a dream draft emphasizing everything DHS would want from that strategy document, including a focus on domestic terrorist threats, along with threats from radical Islamist terrorism and other foreign actors. 4 months after Nielsen started as DHS Secretary, Trump replaced McMaster with John Bolton. The process of drafting the counterterrorism strategy continued under Bolton's leadership. What ended up getting significantly dropped was all the stuff we talked about on domestic terrorism, Taylor said. We got a draft back from John Bolton that barely referenced domestic terrorism. Nielsen wasn't happy, according to Taylor. She was like, what gives? Taylor said. He was like, we're doing more drafts. We're doing more turns on it. Just stay tuned. We'll work on this. And she said, it's very important to me that we emphasize domestic terrorism here. This has got to be an administration priority. The final document, released on October 4th, 2018, contained just 2 short paragraphs on domestic terrorism. One noted that the U.S. faced internal threats from racially motivated extremism, animal rights extremism, environmental extremism, sovereign citizen extremism, and militia extremism. A second promised that the government would, quote, investigate ties between domestic terrorists not motivated by radical Islamist ideologies and their overseas counterparts to more fully understand them. It was brief. They said, we'll come up with a separate domestic terrorism strategy, Taylor said. Well, BS. They never did it. It just got lost. Bolton declined to comment on this reporting. Alyssa Farah, the White House spokesperson, said the Trump administration takes domestic terrorism threat seriously. Our country is constantly facing dynamic threats ranging from domestic to cyber to international to financial crimes, she said in a statement to Politico. Gee whiz, that is helpful. Our brave federal law enforcement, national security, and intelligence officials work around the clock to monitor every range of threats facing our nation, including domestic terror. This sounds more like a case of Miles Taylor being ineffective at his job than an indictment of the brave men and women, once again, in security officials. That's what it says. FBI and federal law enforcement who work every day to protect our country from threats, foreign and domestic. So it's the same thing twice with a shot at Miles Taylor in the middle. 3 weeks after the strategy's release on October 27th, 2018, a gunman named Robert Bowers murdered 11 people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Before the massacre, he posted a message on the social networking site Gab about a Jewish nonprofit that helps refugees settle in the U.S. HIAS likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. So I'm going to kill people. What is a genius plan? He wrote of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics. I'm going in. From her perch at DHS, meanwhile, Newman pushed for the department to do more to prevent domestic terror attacks, a concept national security hands refer to as left of boom, as in before an explosion hits. The FBI is the lead law enforcement agency for investigating domestic terror, but DHS's close work with state and local law enforcement agencies around the country, as well as private sector and community partners, means it can also play a role. For instance, advisors from DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency provided a security training that Tree of Life members participated in before the shooting. A top CISA official later told Congress that members of the synagogue said that training saved lives. So, starting in February 2019, Newman pushed to get new funding for the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And in May 2019, Newman said acting DHS head Kevin McLennan made a series of phone calls to the Hill, ringing alarm bells that DHS's work on domestic terrorism was severely underfunded and urging members to fund the effort. After an extensive effort that initially circumvented the White House budgeting process, Congress gave DHS $17 million in new funding for the office and for grants. The concept was to have DHS help state, local, and non-government leaders work in their communities to prevent and reverse violent extremism. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time to complete reading this article, but I do recommend that you take a look through it. Suffice to say, their efforts at establishing an office that would take this on as a mission found no friends in the administration and no interest in the White House, certainly. They went through the motions, and the succession of leadership that continued even after the several heads of DHS and acting heads of DHS that they went through never really expressed any interest in anything that didn't interest the White House. And we went on to see yet more and more strange turns of events. Like, for instance, of course, you may recall the August 3rd and August 4th, 2019 twin mass shootings. The first in the Walmart in El Paso, killing 23 people. And then on August 4th, 9 people killed at a bar in Dayton, Ohio. And that left, unfortunately left everybody scratching their heads not only about what to do, but about what it meant, because, of course, the administration had no interest in owning up to what might possibly really be behind all of this stuff. As a matter of fact, though, the Walmart shooter in El Paso apparently told police that he had been directly inspired by the Christchurch shooting. So I guess you could stand around and just say, well, we can't really be sure, because that's the way the Department of Homeland Security treated it from then on. How odd.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
So here we are, still stuck in the same place. Right-wing extremists were responsible for 2/3 of terror attacks and plots in the U.S. last year, they found, and for 90% in the first 4 months of 2020. And in the meantime, Newman, Taylor, and Mitnick have all left, and all are endorsing Joe Biden for president. No surprise there. See you tomorrow.